and then also type in your own questions or comments that we can then, everybody can see. Or if you click on that everyone button, if you just want to say something to me, or you want to just say something to Jennifer or any other person, you know, let's say for someone that may say something, you say, oh, I could really use that service that they do, or I really wanted to know what book they read, but it's not really relevant to everyone else, you know, or you say, you know, I really do like your hairdo. You know, if you want to say something like that, then you click on the thing that says everyone, and then you can find that person on that list, click on them, and you can send a message to only that person, right? So it could be personal if you like. I think that's the housekeeping. Did I leave out anything, Jennifer?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good. If you have questions, I have answers even before you have the question. I make up the answer just in case people have questions. Okay, so we're going to get started with our interview as Ryan is working in the background trying to help people who didn't manage to get the memo, so to speak, and didn't know how to link on, to help them to get connected. We see a few more people have found us, so let's see if how that will work. Maybe by next week we'll have more people who knew, oh, this is how you get on, you know, because that'll come up. It happens in my other Zoom conferences too. That's why I started putting in the same Zoom link, using the same one every week, because people do things by patterns and they, you know, didn't get the new one. So, but then that opens you up to the Zoom bombers, you know, because they know where you are every time. So this time we changed, and now we're back on schedule. Our guest today is Nicholas Martin. And Nicholas is a journalist, and we're going to I like to have people kind of self-introduce, partly because I think it's not only the words that are important, but to hear the person say in their own voice, this is who I think I am, I think has value, you know. So Nicholas, welcome. And can everybody hear me okay? Is it coming through okay? Okay, good. Welcome, Nicholas. And tell us a little bit about yourself. Start with where you're born and, you know, who is the elevator speech of Nicholas Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was just getting some muting, unmuting technical difficulties taken care of. But no, thank you so much for having me today, Lawrence. I really appreciate coming on. The elevator pitch of Nick Martin. I guess I would just say, you know, I'm born and raised in North Carolina. I was born kind of in a rural mill town, and just kind of largely enjoyed that experience. You know, my parents, my mom and dad are both from tobacco farming country, and my dad's a member of the Saponi tribe in North Carolina, which is one of the 7 state recognized tribes in the state. And so I just kind of, in terms of my path to journalism, I was always a big reader as a child. You know, went to college, got into the college newspaper. I started off doing actually college athletics reporting, which led me down the road of doing lots of public records requests and Freedom of Information Act requests, just kind of digging through all different kind of files, doing investigative reporting on things like coaching abuse and sexual abuse that exists on college campuses and within college athletics. And from there, I kind of made the jump. I'd worked at some more, I guess you would say, legacy journalism outlets. So thinking the News and Observer in Raleigh, I worked for about half a year when I was in college for the Washington Post. And then I made the jump to more digital journalism. So I started off at Deadspin, which was a sports site and where I covered college athletics for about I guess about 2 years. And then I made, around the time of the, I guess, post 2016 election, you know, I had always kind of been a really big history buff, somebody that was very grounded in, you know, my personal, my family, and my tribe's history. But then I also just kind of would tug on that ball of yarn and just wanted to expand my knowledge and know more about the political and cultural history of North Carolina politics. And that kind of led me to doing this book-length project for my online site, where I delved into a lot of different things around North Carolina politics, going from labor unions in the South to the kind of tri-segregation that happened between Native, Black, and white people. And that kind of led me to make a career pivot into my current role, which is, now for the past, I guess, 2 years, I've covered Indian country nationally as a beat. And first for a year, or I guess about 9 months, at a site called Splinter. And now I work for the magazine, The New Republic. And that brings me up to where I am now.
All right. And then you did a Zoom conference.
And then I've done a Zoom conference.
The pinnacle of your career.
Right.
Well, okay. So in our subject today really is about objectivity in the news. We hear a lot about fake news, and we have a lot of distrust of the media. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about and get under the hood of what goes into what is objective reporting. Okay, so probably the best place to start is with a definition of terms. What is objective reporting to you as a reporter?
Yeah, absolutely. So objective reporter, as it's kind of been trained and taught to me over the years, it basically just means that you remove yourself and your personal views from a given story or a given reporting project. So that's to say, if I believe that the sky is pink and I'm doing a report on the color of the sky, I cannot bring whatever my past biases into that discussion. And so that's just kind of, just as I guess a basic definition, that's how I would define objective journalism, just not letting your personal views kind of dictate what your end product is.
Okay. So that brings up, actually, the definition itself brings up the complication of doing objective reporting, because whatever you see is dependent on what you've seen before. That's how the brain makes up what you see. It's like it takes previous information that it creates a framework with, and then it tries to make sense of what it's seeing right now. To that degree, I mean, with that in mind, I should say, how do you approach not letting your limits in experience or some particular experience color what you're seeing now, even before you get to the reporting? What are the kind of things you do to say, okay, let me see what is here now, as opposed to trying to link it to something else that I'm thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the number one thing I try to do before I dive into any project is ask myself, what I don't know. And then I try to go about speaking and reading people who do know about that subject. Because for me, I think a lot of times we get into the problem of people start with what they know and then they shape their reporting around that. And so I'm not perfect at this. I still am working on it, but I think one thing that I always try to do is identify early on in the reporting process what it is that my personal shortcomings or my academic shortcomings might be on a given subject. And then I'll, seek out the proper, academic or even just an organizer or just somebody who has a lived experience in the subject matter that is able to maybe bridge the gap for me as a reporter, who is then trying to bridge the gap for the general public or my reading audience. So that's kind of the first step I take, is just asking myself, what do I not know about this and who can help me kind of explain that.
Mm-hmm. So are there other things that you do? That was the first step. There are other filters or exercises, or how do you actually, in fact, go about doing that?
So I think the first thing, like after I've kind of asked myself, like where are the holes in this, in my knowledge on this subject? One thing I kind of do is try to compile, uh, you know, like first I try to compile an outline of just writing a thesis statement of what do I think this piece is going to be about, or what do I think that we should be able to turn up in this particular reporting. And from there, I will kind of draw up an outline of what I kind of hope the piece will shape into be. But then I also do an extraordinary amount of reading. Off screen there, I'm currently in my office space that is under somewhat construction, but I've got many complaints from my partner about how many books are littered around, articles we've printed off and things like that. So I think the first process is just knowledge, gathering that knowledge and information, trying to then structure it in a way that will make sense to a person who might be coming to a subject for a first time. And this is also gets into something as a reporter on Indian country, which is a subject that I would say the majority of Americans aren't necessarily particularly, up on in terms of a very modern understanding of what tribal communities and tribal governments function as now. And again, a lot of that depends on your personal experience. If you grew up near a tribal community or tribal nation, if you've, kind of been in that community or nation, it all is dependent upon that. And so I have to kind of ask myself again, after I've asked myself, what do I not know? I have to also kind of balance, given my audience, what do I think the audience is not going to know, and how do I frame that? How do I frame this information in a way that one doesn't read like a Wikipedia article where it's like, here's all the little facts you need, and then we'll talk to this person. And I just try to make it a little bit more engaging and interesting than that, but at the same time, just trying to acknowledge where and understand where those shortcomings might arise.
Mm-hmm. That brings us really to the writing and editing of the story. So now you have gotten the facts together, and you're now ready to sort of put them into a shape that your readers / audience can see the things that you're trying to say. They can perceive and get as close to the same message as you are trying to put out. Not only the writer, but the reader also comes with biases. They come with expectations. They come with certain life experiences that either enhances or limits their ability to understand what you're saying. What are the struggles that you go through as a writer to negotiate or act as a go-between between those two? How do you handle that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is something that's come up a lot, just kind of in the reporting that I've done. I would say that for me, my experience in terms of my childhood experience and my just, I guess, formational experience was, I didn't grow up on a reservation. I did not grow up, in that kind of tribal community. I grew up going back to my community. So for me, I think what a big thing in terms of my reporting on Indian country is something that I've had a lot of conversations with, urban natives, with people who live in suburb natives, people who grew up and lived on the reservation and then moved, and people who moved and came back. I'm trying to grasp all of these different understandings of what it means to be a Native person in 2020 and so forth. And I think for me, what that has kind of proven over the course of the reporting over the past 2 years is that, I just, listening is really key for me. Listening, I try not to say, this is my experience, so this is everybody's experience. And I think that at the same time, anybody who's a writer is naturally inclined, maybe not anybody who's a writer, but many writers are just naturally inclined, because we want, it's a public facing profession. The idea of putting words down on the page and expecting somebody else to read them and learn from them, you are inherently putting yourself out there. And so in putting yourself out there, you also just have to kind of take the step and understand, especially as a reporter, when you're trying to do, this is kind of gets in between the difference of fiction writing and nonfiction writing, and as well as reporting. it just speaks to the idea of like, we are not always the story. A reporter doesn't like, there are times when I've written columns that come from a personal place, opinion articles that I'm trying to make an impassioned plea about something based on my life experience or based on the experience of people close to me. But at the same time, have to recognize that the majority of stories are not and should not be that way. And I think for me, as as a young writer, somebody just has been trying to figure things out in the past 4 years since I've graduated college, is that it's not necessarily the onus and the responsibility of the reader isn't to know me, it's to know the subject matter that I'm reporting. And so that's something that I've had to combat a lot. And I've talked to other reporters that have had to do the same thing, especially folks who work kind of like me, where I'm not somebody like an Associated Press reporter who's just the facts. I'm somebody that kind of mixes a blend of objective reporting with my personal viewpoints and the viewpoints of the people that I speak with. And so that kind of walking that tightrope is something, I've done it well sometimes and I've done it not well sometimes. And I think that for me has just been growing in that area has been really key for me.
One of the trends that I've noticed in writing is mixing facts with fiction. Mm-hmm. And on the extreme of that, they'll say, well, we're trying to color it and make it more interesting. That seems like it's a weak bridge, that can be problematic pretty quick. So I'm wondering, how does a reporter, or what is the thinking among reporters, and particularly your own thinking, about making an article interesting while keeping it critically factual? Because it's not just how you think about something, it's how you feel about something. So you can say all the exact facts, but then if you color it with words that mean exactly something, but those words carry a certain kind of baggage that that colors an article one way or the other. How do you negotiate that?
I think that's an ongoing, I think that's an everyday you wake up and you fight that battle as a reporter, especially like I was saying in the kind of work that I do. But the one thing that I think has kind of made this such a relevant discussion to the current moment is we have to look at, one is how people consume their news now. Like, everybody's not turning on the 6 o'clock news and, listening to their local anchor all the time. I mean, many people are, but, people have now kind of migrated over to places like Facebook or places like Twitter, or just these social media mediums in which the fact-checking process is 0 to none, basically. So I think that for, as a reporter who always strives to achieve that balance between like being able to write, in a strong, very personalized, individualistic voice, but at the same time sticking to the critical facts of a case, it's always going, like, you're never going to hit that balance perfectly for anybody else, because as a writer, you're writing that balance. Like I said, like you have to constantly be trying to bring the reader into it. You have to constantly be trying to bring your audience along with you. But at the end of the day, you're writing what you believe, and that cannot be, conversely, you cannot let what you believe shade a story that has to have and be at its core an objective truth. Every story at its core has to be founded in objective truth. And I think that balancing those two things, there's a tendency, for people to kind of see that it's very easy to, blur that line, to kind of disconfigure facts to fit what they want a particular narrative to be, and it's easy to do that because it's lucrative to do that. There's a whole cottage industry of on all sides of folks on for me, I see Facebook as kind of like the main area for that, but I've also seen it elsewhere. But it's been something where we see the kind of like falser and falser narratives be propagated, and then if you look to like what the top 100 posts on Facebook any given month are, they're all conspiracy theories that largely aren't grounded in truth, but it's presented in a way on your news feed that makes you believe that there is truth to it, that there is just that little bit of truth to it. And I think that people have become accustomed to having that subjectivity mixed in with their objective reporting, that as it maybe started in a good place and is kind of just pulled out apart. And now we're in a place where, people always believe, crazy things because crazy things happen all the time. And I think that's just kind of, social media has just kind of been a good breeding ground for seeing how far the limitations of, that subjectivity over objectivity can be pushed.
That is so important to say, and I'm glad that you brought that out. I'm looking at like, let's say Facebook, and I noticed that people who distrust the media will trust any meme that comes on, somebody that pops up a meme and they're ready to go on that one and argue it and say, yeah, that's true. And then you say, okay, here's this other person. Okay, granted, their headline might be the equivalent of a meme, but they've got documents underneath it. They have like pictures. They have documents that says, hey, this person said this. They have a copy of the person's tweet or something like that. Oh, no, that's fake news.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, how do you deal with the audience? How do you write for an audience who sees a Facebook meme as more, let's say, real than a documented report? And they see that as fake news. How do you write for that?
I think that on one hand, you have to it's tough because I think as a reporter, I, can often personally be somewhat of a cynical person, but when it comes to other people, I'm very much an optimist. Like I always try to believe the best in people. And so, and part of that also comes with acknowledging that there are just, I don't know what the percentage point is, but there are going to be people out there that no matter what you put in front of them, they're just going to disagree with you. And that might just be because they like to argue or they like to disagree or like to be contrarian. And I made my peace with that a long time ago. I kind of come, I don't know anybody's been able to pick up on this, but I'm a left-leaning journalist, but I grew up in a town that very much wasn't that. I grew up in a town, I think we went for Trump something like 75-25 percentage points in 2016. And so I know, I don't look at other people based on partisan views and say, well, you're just objectively wrong because you hold a different partisan view from me. I know how to have discussions with people who disagree with me. And I think that life experience for me was really formative because now when I get, when I'm doing these posts and writing things or I'm interviewing people, I don't let kind of maybe the fringe that is just kind of tries to be the loudest voice in the room bother me at all. If I have somebody that philosophically disagrees with the point I'm making, but wants to engage with me on that, that's way more interesting to me than the fringe person shouting, but also anybody that's going to just blatant, just kind of rubber stamp me and agree with me. That I'd rather be engaged with a conversation with somebody that, slightly disagrees with me or takes a different stance on something, because that ultimately breeds a better kind of learning process and learning environment. But again, like you said, there's a whole spectrum of, readers out there and people out there. So it's just learning how to, I don't let that kind of noise interfere with what I'm doing on a daily basis, but I don't tune out people who disagree with me. And I think holding those two things at the same time is really important for all reporters, regardless of where you kind of fall on partisan scale or spectrum.
Along with that same kind of thing, when you're discussing an idea that is, let's say, you kind of assume is new to people. For example, you say you write about Native American experience. Well, there's not a whole bunch of people who, other than Native Americans, who live that experience. And even I find many times the people who live the experience don't really understand what they're going through. So in order to talk about that reasonably, it requires words that people haven't encountered before because they've never discussed that thing. How do you introduce new words or vocabulary, or talk about a subject that requires a different vocabulary? How do you broach that?
This is actually something that's really central to my work, and also just like the professional conversations I have with colleagues across other publications. You know, I think I did a piece recently where we were looking at how the pandemic has kind of played out in Indian country, and for that I was like more interested in showing how national media coverage has kind of framed something like a chronic underfunding of the Indian Health Service. You know, like we think of that as just being another thing that Congress underfunds. And for the piece, I wanted to kind of pull out for people that like, no, this is like IHS is the product of treaties and trust responsibilities that the federal government made in exchange for millions of acres of land that was ceded by tribal nations that still exist today. And when I was talking with a colleague that's the president of the Native American Journalists Association, and he used to be at a publication called High Country News, and they have an Indigenous Affairs desk. And you know, for me, I'm the first Native reporter that the New Republic has ever hired. And they had a very thin catalog of articles prior to me coming on last August. And so that means that institutionally I have to, you know, like outside of the actual reporting work, I have to work to fix terminology in our, you know, like in our copy editor's manual and our style guide. I have to work with our editors on how to frame different stories in a headline. And oftentimes that when it comes to actually writing the copy of the story, writing out the words on the page, you know, we can, and what I see from a lot of legacy publications that don't hire Native people or don't have Indigenous reporters on their staff, is they do a lot of historical explanation. So you'll get like 2 or 3 paragraphs just trying to frame exactly what a given article is talking about before you actually get into that subject matter. And when I was talking to my colleague that is now at the Texas Observer, Tristan Atona, we kind of landed on the fact that like what High Country News has done really well, and what, you know, other publications like the Indigenous Affairs team at Arizona Republic or Indian Country Today, what these publications do well is that, you know, we have to ask, who is a publication writing for? Who is your audience? And if your audience is, you know, suburban, you know, upper middle class white people, then you're going to do a lot of explaining to those people in a way that can oftentimes, I think, can come off as being pedantic or maybe oversimplifying what people might already have like a loose grasp on, or maybe even if they're totally inexperienced with it. And so what he said they did as they formed the team at High Country News is, you know, they just wrote articles without doing those big explainer graphs, and their audience pretty quickly, even if they had no prior experience with a tribal community, if they had, you know, never really engaged with what tribal sovereignty meant, they understood it because it was just contextualized within the piece without, you know, laying out all of this context of like, this is the history of it. And I'm kind of stuck right now in a place in between those two spaces, because as a Native writer, and somebody who's just followed and covered these things for a while, I have a pretty decent sense of familiarity and a high comfort level with writing about, you know, even like complex legal cases that often play out. But, you know, my job as a reporter is to bring along an audience that I recognize does not have that same understanding. And so I'm still in the process of trying to figure out, I'm a year into this job as of 2 weeks ago. And I think I'm just trying to figure out, you know, trying to strike that balance of what is the correct way to explain enough that people can kind of understand what I'm talking about without, again, like I said earlier, turning into just a Wikipedia article. So that's another ongoing yeah, it's an ongoing battle. It's just something that I'm trying to like understand and hammer out and smooth out as my career goes along.
Right. And I think that this is the kind of thing that I wanted to bring out, is like, it's a struggle to make an objective article or even a column or something like that. It's really a struggle because you have all of these limitations, not just in terms of your limitation, but in terms of the audience limitation, because communication is a two-way street. It's not just what you say, it's what's heard. And how do you get what you say to be as close to what people hear as possible? I think that there are lots of barriers to that, and I hope in this discussion we can discover at least a few of those barriers, with the eye on trying to overcome those barriers, or let's say crowd thinking, how we might do that. One last thing before we get into this, open up the discussion. Headline bias. Okay, so a reporter writes a story, but in every publication I've ever worked for, there's somebody else who writes the headlines. Sometimes it's like a headline writer, even if it's the janitor, that somebody else comes in and reads it and say, well, this is about that. And then the headlines tend to have some purpose other than being factual, or like even like trying to tell what the story's about. It's kind of like, I can have a story about Boy Scouts, and if I say Boy Scouts helps old lady, it sells one number of articles, and I say Boy Scout hurts old lady, that's a whole other, like which one of those are going to sell the most papers. Right. So the guy who's writing the headlines, his objective is different than what the writer's is, but it sets up an expectation bias on the part of the reader. How do you negotiate that?
It's something that it requires, and I'll speak just from my experience, because I have also worked in publications, like the News and Observer and like the Washington Post, where I'm not writing the headlines, I'm writing the story. And sometimes, those publications would ask for a headline suggestion, right? They would ask you for this, and then maybe they would tweak it and it would be somewhat similar, or even they keep the same one. But a lot of times it would be something that came from kind of higher up on the org chart, or maybe not even higher up on the org chart, it would come from somewhere else. And for when I made the move into digital journalism, particularly at Deadspin, I wrote the vast majority of my headlines. And that for me was way more comforting, because even if a headline was critiqued or if it was wrong because of me. And that was a personal responsibility that I think made me feel more accountable to the journalism I was doing. And I think that's something that more places should encourage and seek out, is to let their writers try. I mean, it doesn't have to be the exact headline they come up with. I'm still working on my ability to write headlines quickly and succinctly, but I think that it's a great skill to have, because it's similar to writing a thesis statement. Your headline should be able to tell you exactly what you're about to read instantaneously. It doesn't have to give you the full context, obviously, but you should at least have give the reader a good understanding of what's coming in. And working in as news media has all of news media has kind of transitioned more to a digital ad pay scale or a payment model. It has that's definitely been reflected in how headlines are written now. So you see things that try to grab you, exclamation points in headlines now, all sorts of things. And some of them are fun. It's kind of reached the point where it's like the horseshoe, and it's some of it's kind of meta now, and it's funny, and you get really good, clever headlines that play into this. But at the same time, I think we also it's like you said, at the same time, you can go on Facebook and you can see some of the craziest headlines you'll ever witness or read. And for just kind of striking that balance, I guess I've just got one story that kind of gets at this. Last fall, actually my very first piece for the New Republic, so the Washington Post, they had a couple years, I think it was 2016, they ran a survey where they allowed people who could self-identify as Native people to say whether or not they thought the Washington NFL team, the name was right or wrong. And so then they kind of, the week I joined, they put out a similar survey done by a private third-party company, and one of the columnists at the Washington Post wrote about it. And so anyways, I kind of wrote up why these polls were inherently flawed, and got into like why the team name should have been removed and all of that. And what ended up happening was I had a headline that I wrote for the piece, and it was like R word. So we didn't actually use the word. We used like R dash word. And the headline got changed to have the actual R word in the headline. And that I then had like Native reporter colleagues reach out to me and be like, your headline kind of immediately disqualifies the very good article you wrote. And this prompted a discussion with my editor, and we were actually able to address it publicly in a separate article I wrote most recently, I guess about a month and a half or 2 months ago, when the team officially changed its name, and just got into like the media's responsibility of like, you can, if you're going to write a column, if you're going to institutionally have your editorial board say this word is a slur and shouldn't use it, then you probably shouldn't have a link to it with the word on your website of all the team's coverage or something like that. And so that for me was a moment of not just trying to get a headline editorially correct, it was also a moment of trying to hold an institution accountable to the reporting that it was and the viewpoints that it was kind of propagating. And so that's like, and again, the whole reason that we put the name, that the editor put the name in the headline, was because of, it's called search engine optimization, or SEO. And that's how, if you go on Google and you're looking for a story about the latest news, it's based on the search terms that you use. And that's how these headlines have kind of been crafted and created, and it's created this whole game of how to game SEO. And that's where decisions like those come from. It's about, you want to get your story in front of the most eyes possible because that creates advertising revenue for you. But I guess at a certain point, you have to understand, like, at what cost or at what point are you willing to say, no, this headline needs to, actually reflect what a piece is, trying to say.
That always struck me as a very difficult balance. Yeah. Because it's not only the revenue. I think revenue is a good case to make, but I think it's like, well, who's going to stop and read the article? It gets back to the boys, the boy and the grandma. It's like, well, if you say that, hey, the boy always helped this little old lady, but then you have one that, hey, this boy really hurt this old lady. If more people are going to read that, not only do you write that headline, but you go after more stories that say that where the Boy Scout or the boy hurt little old ladies. And then pretty soon people have an idea that boys are just hurting little old ladies. But in a sense, the public kind of like squeezed you into that, because if you wrote the other stories, well, you wrote it, you did a good story, but nobody read it. It's like the tree that falls in the forest and nobody hears it. It's like, was it really a thing? So,
right. Yeah, that's tricky. And it's something that I think the industry is still trying to figure out. But yeah, I think that's just going to be one of those things where it requires editors and headline writers and again, this is something a colleague reached out to me and said, which is that after that story, which is that, you might be a younger writer, not as long tenured as these other people at this institution, but you still have a voice to speak up in those instances. So I think it's just about, it's balancing that desire and need, because, if you have a string of stories that are really good stories, but nobody reads, and a lot of times there's a really great story on a website, the sister site I used to write for, Jezebel, where they're talking about how abortion coverage is largely like, it's just not clicked on that much. And so that has kind of cycled editors to turn down pitches on those kind of stories, which are obviously vitally important to, how people interact with the world and, are able to access that kind of healthcare. And it's just, it's a cycle where that feeds back into itself, where if you want your coverage to be maintained, if you want an editor to pay you and keep you on and continue to, say that it's like, for me, it's like, I want people to read my Indian country coverage, because that gives me, one, that gives me job security, but two, it means that other institutions will say, we need a reporter like that, and we need to up our coverage in this area. And it's all like a game of trying to figure out, like, balance that, like, what do we as an institution hold as being editorially important, and what do we feel is necessary to report on, and then also at the same time is like, what's bringing in revenue. So it's a tricky balance, and I think all kind of outlets are still figuring it out.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I would like to open it up now to our esteemed participants in this endeavor. Before I do that, however, I want to reiterate that our new kind of format here is based on let's say, a response to an experience we had last week, where we were Zoom bombed, and we're trying to figure out ways to sort of like keep the Zoom bombers out, but at the same time maximize our ability to interact with each other. And that's tricky business, because the Zoom bombers are drinking their mellow yellow and pizza and eating pizza, and they're trying to figure out new ways to override whatever things we do. So stay tuned. Okay, so I guess right now, Ryan, who's at the control, or Jennifer, who also has some controls, we can allow you to, if you have something to ask or to contribute to this conversation, you should be now able to click on your unmute button and to be able to join our conversation. I think, is that on now? Are we ready for that? Jennifer and Ryan, can they do that now? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so if you have a question, I'm going to open it up to our participants in this discussion. Any question that you have, anything that came up while we were talking that you would like to ask? Did I put you all to sleep? So you just have to click on your microphone, the little microphone on the side that has a microphone crossed out, and then you can unmute yourself. Or that's in the lower left-hand corner, and then on the upper right-hand corner, there's also an opportunity. If you hover over that, you should be able to unmute yourself. The little blue light will come on, or spot will come on if you put your cursor over that upper right-hand corner.
And Fedora has raised her hand, so I have unmuted her. She's
okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Nicholas. When you started, you spoke about interacting with other tribal members, in the city, and so I know you said a lot after that, but I kind of got stuck there. How, as you've considered trying to help tribal members with all the stuff going on, especially like the COVID and all of that, how do you reach out to them?
Just in general, how do I reach out to folks? I would say, a lot of that's just like, it was easier before. Obviously, all of this because I was able to go, in person, or just in general, I could travel places and do my reporting work. So that has obviously been limited by the pandemic. But the main thing is, it's just picking up the phone. It's picking up the phone and calling different, urban Indian organizations, like I'm just referencing what you're saying about folks in the city. And then it's also just like people I've met over the years, and a lot of times somebody can put you into contact with somebody else, And these things tend to be a small world, and not just in my Indian country reporting, but in all of my reporting, I found that the world is much smaller than the billions of people would have me think it is. And so that's it. It's about picking up the phone. It's about
I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nicholas. I wasn't clear, and I'll give you kind of an example.
Okay.
In the minority community, well, in the Black community, mm-hmm. and in certain Black communities, when you come in as another person of color to speak, you're sometimes seen as not one of, because you've been somewhere else. And so you have things you want to share, and you want to say, well, we can do things better.
More people and more frequently. I just don't think we have enough.
Okay. I thought, oh no, not another Zoom bomb. Anyway, do you get where I'm going? So you would be seen as not from the res, I assume.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And so how do you get past that to get the conversation going with the young people on the res?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's something that I think it requires, like with anything. I mean, the one thing we've seen reporters do over the years, specifically as it comes to like reservation reporting, is they kind of parachute in and they want to get, like, you see these really splashy features extending from like the 1960s and 50s all the way up to the 2020s of a New York Times reporter dropping in and saying, this is what it's like. They try to like capture it, and it becomes this really voyeuristic, kind of gross depiction of people, which is like a community just trying to live their lives. And so for me, what I've kind of taken to heart in doing that kind of reporting is I'm not going to try to explain to anybody and say, this is what that experience is like. If I can do that through sharing somebody else's experience, I try to be respectful and let their voice guide it. I don't try to let any parentheticals from me or any kind of subjectivity or commentary on that from me, inflect or kind of distort what their lived experience is. And just in terms of getting people to engage and to speak with me, be it young people or old people, you can kind of tell when I've noticed when I've talked to folks that if you're somebody who's genuine and you're somebody who's like not coming in with a preconceived notion or a story that's already written in your head, if you're actually there to listen, people will generally trust you. And that doesn't, and there's lots of media distrust, especially among Native populations, because like we have not always been represented in a fair and equitable fashion. And so for me, I've always just really strived to just like, whenever I have a conversation, I try to do like as little talking as possible. I'm just like, I have my questions kind of in my head, but I also try to make it very conversational. I don't try to say, like, I don't come in with I'm taking notes during this. Like, I don't come in with like a list of like, here's 8 questions I'm going to ask you, because then it becomes a much more mechanical and not really human kind of conversation. So I just kind of come in from a perspective of, you are the person, you are the expert, and whether that is a person that is an academic person or whether that's just a random person that I'm talking to, on the res or on the street or like wherever. It's like, you are the expert in this piece. I am the person that is just trying to be the conduit between you and the rest of the world. And so I just, I try to remove myself and my lived experience from that and just accept that like what they're going to share with me is going to be entirely what they want to share. I'm not trying to push people to share things that, I mean, there are a lot of things, not just in tribal communities, in all communities, where it's like there's certain things that you don't talk about with people from outside that community. And I think as a reporter, you have to be completely fine with that. And I'm completely like, I know I could generally as I've had more and more of these conversations, I know the boundaries and things to ask. But does that mean like if I get a tribal leader on the phone and they've made some outrageous comment, or they misappropriated funds, that I can't also hold that person accountable? No. I just think that at the same time, it's just about having respect and listening.
I think one of the words that you mentioned that is really critical in all of this is trust. From a reporter's point of view, is like, how do you build trust? And I haven't found it so much different from one person to the next. Building trust. One, it takes time, and you work at it a long time, and you can do one thing and break it. It's like building. It's like making a clay pot. It might take months to build, and then all you have to do is have one flick of the elbow, and then the thing is like shattered.
That's right.
Other questions? Someone else has a question for Nick. How about that bird? Anybody not? If you no question from the Blue Jay in the chat. It said, okay, so if you have questions, feel free, or you want to ask a question or something like that. As I mentioned before, people are muted until, I think you're unmuted now. You have to unmute yourself. So when we started, everyone was muted, and no matter what you did, you couldn't get in. Now you can, we think that Zoom bomber has gone to sleep, we hope, so they won't notice. But if you have a question, please let us know one way or the other. Just unmute yourself and ask your question or something. So with that said, I'm going to continue. There are numbers of ways that people build trust and approach a person that you're going to be a victim, that you're going to interview, okay? So you said before that you'll reach out, you pick up the phone, okay? And of course, that's the mechanical thing to do, but then just your approach, how do you go building the trust to the point that people can be candid with you? Because if we're talking about objective truth, you have to get that objective truth from some source. And if that source is not objective, then I don't see how your story can be objective as well.
Right. I think, for me, that's been a process of a big word that in theme that I've kind of tried to center in that, like after you do the actual process of picking up the phone, is reciprocity. It's the idea of that if somebody's going to share something very personal with you, you should be willing to share something very personal with them. And that means just having a certain candidness, not just on like expecting that from them, but being able to reflect that yourself. And so, for me, that's just about, I'm trying to think, I recently did a piece where I spoke with a woman who was a citizen of the Red Lake Nation, but she was living in Minneapolis. And at the start of the pandemic in March, her and her partner were, they lost their home, and so they had been unhoused. And then the George Floyd protest happened, and she was, I think, part of the group that occupied a Sheraton hotel. It was a group of the homeless population there, and a lot of folks in the community kind of got together, saw a vacant hotel, and they went and they made that kind of a sanctuary for folks. And so I connected with this person, and this is like one of the hardest. She's discussing with me one of the toughest, I guess, like 4-month stretches of her life so far, because that was not something that she had been entirely used to. And we just had to there were so many moments in that conversation where it became less about like, well, tell me, okay, so what happened then? And what happened then? It became less of that, and it became about more like us just discussing the emotional weight of that for her. It became me sharing, experiences and past conversations I've had, and then just trying to not, it's like if you go in and you're trying to get somebody to open up to you, I think that you kind of, you fail from the jump there, because like that's not the goal. The goal for me is to connect with somebody, because if you connect with somebody in one of these, in an interview or a conversation, the actual Q&A part of that will come naturally. The questions, like if you know what you're going to ask that person already, I don't like come into something with a list of questions that says like, this is what I want from you, because then that turns that person into not quite a commodity, but it turns them into like, you're just trying to pull a lever and get the right response from them so you can get a quote to put in your, to paste in your story. And that is the entirely wrong approach. It's not a human approach to reporting. It's not community journalism. And so for me, especially as somebody who's reporting so widely across, I mean, there are 574 tribal nations there, that's and hundreds more of individual communities within that. And so you're not going to ever be able to relate to every single person out there. But what you can do is you can be just like a compassionate person. And through that, through sharing, and again, that's not always going to work. I've had conversations that like where I've taken that tact and that person's just not ready to share, or that person's just not ready to have that conversation. And you have to be okay with that. But I think for me, the best method has just been, you know, be a person that's willing to open yourself up, because that's the only way you're going to get someone else to open themselves up to you, especially when you're somebody that's then going to turn around and print their words or their stories in something that's going to be, you know, projected out to, you know, thousands of people. You have to like know that if there has to be a sense, again, I use this word a lot, but there has to be a sense of accountability. And that doesn't just come from an institutional standpoint, it comes from a personal standpoint. You have to feel like when you write this story, you're accountable to that person and to how they feel about the story. And that doesn't mean you have to write something that they like, but you have to write something that is true to the heart of what they're sharing with you. And that's just kind of the approach I've taken.
That really brings up the whole notion of objective truth, and then there's emotional truth. You know, it's like it's not just what they say, but can you transmit through the way you report it what they are feeling? Can you talk a little bit about, you know, your approach to that? And then how do you try to translate that into a piece?
Yeah, I think that can be, especially when you're doing investigative pieces or pieces that are trying to highlight, you know, maybe the uglier sides of human nature, that can be particularly difficult because, you know, when in a piece like the one I was just describing, that was a little bit more, it was what we call an as told to. So like the whole idea of it was to, like, I wasn't going to contextualize the piece. I was specifically only using her words, and it would just like, so we had a whole conversation and then I would construct it in a linear fashion. And so that's like one way that I've kind of found in that at our vertical at the New Republic, we've kind of found it is a useful way to bring that emotional weight into it, because it can kind of be sapped out sometimes when you are quoting somebody and then who shares a very personal human story with you, and then you're like, and then you quote statistics, because then it's like you're saying this is the emotional toll, but of what these behind these statistics, but at the same time this person is just one of those statistics. And so I think that is like that form of an as told to, or just trying to feature somebody's you know, not just their personal day-to-day experience, but the emotional effect of that experience is really a crucial way to kind of get at what you're talking about there. Another way I think for me has just been in terms of bringing that emotional weight that people share with you in the stories is, you know, when I'm writing through my first drafts, I'm pretty, yes, going back over all my editors that I've had so far in my career, they would all tell you that Nick Martin files extremely long first drafts because I feel like it's important for me to write it through one time where I really am granting people as much space as possible to share. And then you will sit there with an editor and you can kind of pare down, you know, a quote that might be this long to something this long, but you can really work with somebody else to bring the heart of what they're trying to say out of it. So I mean, it's tough sometimes, but I think that, because especially when, I've written stories on coaching and sexual abuse, especially when I was doing my college athletics beat, and those stories were tough because these people, this isn't like when you're writing about something that's a trend or something that's a pattern of behavior for a given coach or someone, even when folks can kind of understand that they're part of that pattern, it's not a pattern to them as much as it is an insanely disruptive part of their life. It's a huge facet of that. And so I think trying to pull that out and trying to explain to people and your readers how these things can take emotional tolls on people, it requires practice is one. You just have to do it a lot. You have to, like, reporting, it's the same as writing, where it's like every interview I do, I think, is better than the last interview I did, because I keep learning things interview to interview. And it's the same way that each draft for me just continues to, like, I just try to make it a constant learning experience in that way. So bringing the emotional effect as well as just the maybe larger macro trends that we write about so often. It's not just that, it's something that is difficult to do or is trying to do, but it's absolutely necessary to do if you want your journalism to be read and responded to in a way that I think a lot of reporters do.
It's been said that, how do you say, data is not the same as an anecdote, or anecdotes are not data, okay? But I've observed that people respond more to narratives than they do facts. Like you were saying, if you write a Wikipedia article and put just all the facts down and even put them in chronological order, alphabetical order, or whatever kind of order you get, somehow people miss the story until you can make a narrative. But the narrative is almost by definition an anecdote, right? How do you bridge that gap?
I think this is again, it almost kind of gets back to it's similar to what we were talking about before, where you're trying to go between over-explaining certain facets of what it means to exist in Indian country versus just taking, like, your audience, not taking them by the hand, but just kind of expecting them to raise up to a point of knowledge that they can be comfortable reading your covers consistently. And so I think in this idea, it's more something where you just have to develop a kind of and this again becomes my personal experience. I've had fairly stable jobs where I've held a job for a year, and over that year I'm able to establish a certain, I guess, rapport, not just with the readership, but with people who are actively looking to engage with that kind of subject. And so for me, you can see sources come out in a way that where it's like, well, I read something you did a few months ago, so now I think it'd be interesting to speak with you or share my experience on this. And that's how you get a lot of for people who are mainly investigative reporters. Once you kind of build up those kind of clips, your name kind of travels beyond just like the people reading you. It travels into circles where people might not read you, but have been affected by a certain thing, might reach out to you. So when that happens and you're trying to explain a person's narrative versus explaining all the facts of a case, what you have to do is you have to kind of find that fine line where you can contextualize what they're saying within a larger trend or a larger event, but you're not wholly erasing them. So, one thing people will do is they'll write a narrative lead, where it's like the first 3 paragraphs of a story. You're not getting any of the context. You're being zoomed in super close to one person's story. And then it'll kind of take you to what's known as a nut graph, where it's like you zoom back out. You say, and this is da-da-da-da-da, or an example of this, an example of that. And then you can kind of hop back and forth in between doing that narrative as well as doing the personal part of the reporting.
And that, of course, brings us to how what you write impacts people.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm sure that other than getting a paycheck, you want your writing to mean something to people after they read it and affect their lives. Can you give us, speaking of anecdotes, can you give us an example of some feedback or something you saw happen as a result of your writing? And in my case, I wrote an article about wage differences.
Mhm.
And I was in a nursing home, and one of the nurses' aides stopped me and said, "Hey, I want to thank you for that article. After that article, we got $1 an hour raise." So that was like, okay, that was worth writing that article. Okay, so I'm sure you probably have even bigger stories than that because you write for a bigger article audience, and you also, to my mind, write more important stuff. So can you give us some anecdotes about how your writing has impacted people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, like, I think getting workers $1 raise is extremely important. I would not discount that. I think things like that on a human personal level are, that's when that kind of like all the hours of doing the bad interviews and all the red lines through the copy are kind of made worth it. So I guess for me, like going back to maybe this one that sticks with me was I was writing when I was doing the college athletics beat for Deadspin. I was writing. I'd written a couple stories just on like coaching situations and kind of the imbalance that a coach to player environment in the NCAA can breed sometimes. And I had a guy that just read those stories and was a reader of the site randomly emailed me. And you fast forward 4 months, he had emailed me about a tip about kind of racist coaching actions going on at Brandeis University by the head men's basketball coach. And so I sit there and I talk. I spent a couple months talking with all these players. And I go through all the rosters, and you can kind of see that Black players compared to white players at the school were transferring out or leaving the team very quickly, and so you could kind of establish that data point or trend. And then I got the narrative of what these people's lived experience was with this particular coach. And by the end of, I guess that like I'd first started doing that reporting in February, and by May, when I brought all my findings to the university, they opened an investigation. They put out a statement, and then 3 months later, they had almost entirely, because what we showed was that it was a system of like where the people would go to the athletic director or the kind of the human resources person for the athletics department, and they would complain, and then they would just kind of fall on deaf ears because those people were like really close with the coach. And so when we brought all these findings, they brought in 2 former U.S. attorneys, and they spent 3 months doing exactly what I did, and they put out like a 70-page report or 30, I can't remember how many, it was many pages, that essentially confirmed everything that I did. And what happened was that the coach he had been removed. The people that in power that ignored these players were, kind of taken or reorganized within the organization or left. And the team got a new coach and had for years just kind of mired in mediocrity as a result of a very toxic coaching environment. And the very next year, they had they had one of their best records in like a decade or something like that. And the players reached out to me and were just really appreciative of the work that had been done there. And one thing I always tried to like reflect back to them was like, all I did was take a bunch of different stories and apply a little bit of public pressure to the situation that you had been spending years trying to deal with privately. And so really like the onus was like the responsibility there was less for the into action. There was less on me. It was on them for being brave enough to use their names and speak publicly, because that's speaking publicly against somebody when you're on the other end of that power imbalance is very difficult. And so that was like one thing where it's like, it felt like, and what they voiced to me was that like, it was not just like that they were happy that future players wouldn't have to deal with that. It allowed them a sense of not just empowerment, but of being heard. And that's just one, like, that's just like one story that always really stuck with me, because it's not a big, it's not a particularly big program. It's not like a UNC or Kentucky or Kansas or some other big sports program, but like, it mattered to these people, and it mattered that change happened. And it was, I guess, really affecting for me, just to kind of be a part of that in a professional manner.
Well, Nicholas, this has been a wonderful treat for me, and apparently for our other participants as well. We're getting at least some notes in the chat section here. I'd like to thank you again for participating with us, and we hope to see you sometime is he going to be in our book festival?
He sure is. So we'll have, and we'll soon be releasing the schedule. So we'll have him talking a little bit more about rural journalism and some other ideas. So sdbookfestival.com, keep an eye on it.
Okay, or look, yeah, hope that all of you will join us in that endeavor as well. We look forward to seeing Nicholas in that and hearing more of his ideas. We hope that you'll join us next week, same time, same station, to explore another subject. Next week, we're going to be actually talking about voting and the efforts that the League of Women Voters are making to get you to vote, and what you can do to help others and encourage other people to exercise their, I call it an obligation, to vote. So with that, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Lawrence.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.